and rewriting of John Hope Franklin's classic From Slavery to Freedom, which was first published in 1947 and was then published under both of their names in 2010. The recipient of numerous awards, Professor Higginbotham received the 2014 National Humanities Medal from President Obama for, quote, illuminating the African-American journey, end quote. Few have illuminated this history with as much rigor and grace as Professor Higginbotham. Please join me in welcoming her today as she says a few words about Robert A. Hill before he delivers his Du Bois lecture. Thank you.
Well, it is a pleasure to be here, and I am certainly honored to introduce my good friend, Professor Robert Hill. Now, you're currently the visiting research scholar in residence at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica. Can you hear me? Is it working? Okay. Robert Hill taught on the faculty of the Department of History at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, for over 3 decades, moving from the ranks of assistant professor to full professor. In 2012, he became research professor of history at UCLA, and in the fall of 2012, he also held the position of John Hinckley Visiting Professor in the Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. Robert Hill is famously known as the founder and editor-in-chief of the Marcus Garvey and Universal Negro Improvement Association papers. Through his assiduous efforts at collecting and editing the Garvey papers over the many years, and through his own writings about Garvey, Robert Hill has long been credited with being the singular figure to have made possible the burst of scholarship on Marcus Garvey in the 21st century. And it is because of Robert Hill that scholarship on Garvey has grown at such a rapid pace, with new and award-winning monographs on Garvey, and they have just grown, as I said, rapidly. Garvey's influence in northern and southern cities in the United States is now well written about. In the rural South, Hill's sequential volumes of Garvey's papers led to studies of Garvey's influence in the Caribbean, in Latin America, Africa, and to the subject of the Garvey movement in religious studies and in Black women's history. We see Hill's mastery of information in published journal interviews with him, and in his role as advisor to projects, for example, to the filmmaker Stanley Nelson's Marcus Garvey, Look for Me in the Whirlwind. The many and varied scholarly perspectives owe their existence to the groundwork laid by Robert Hill, who has provided a window onto Marcus Garvey in all his fervor and in all his complexity. My own student, Adam Ewing, who received his PhD in Harvard, at Harvard in the history department, wrote his dissertation on the global impact of Garvey's ideology, and from which Ewing published his path-breaking book in 2012, titled The Age of Garvey: How a Jamaican Activist Created a Mass Movement and Changed Global Black Politics. None of this work would have been accomplished without Robert Hill. The David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University now houses the Robert Hill papers. The Robert Hill Collection, which has amassed documents dating from 1800 to 2014. The collection is a testament to his critical role in the creation of an extensive archive of transnational significance. It includes writings by and about Hill himself, the Garvey papers, of course, and other related documents, as well as C.L.R. James's papers, of which Hill is the general editor. Hill's numerous writings focus on such figures as C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, George Beckford, George Schuyler, Cyril Briggs, and early proponents of Pan-Africanism, such as our own W.E.B. Du Bois and J. Albert Thorne of Guyana and Chief Charles Sam of the Gold Coast, to name only a few individuals. And I have to say, on a personal level, what a genuine and generous purveyor of knowledge Robert Hill is. A year ago this time, I was in correspondence with Bobby, as his friends call him. And I happened to mention that I knew a great deal about my father's history in Richmond, Virginia, but I knew very little about my mother's family, who had migrated from Jamaica to Harlem during the second decade of the 20th century, during the 1910s, when Garveyism was at its height of influence in New York. In fact, my mother had told me, even before I knew the importance of this, that her godfather, her own godfather, was a man named Ely Garcia. And Ely Garcia was a major figure in the Garvey movement. Now, I mentioned in my emails to Bobby that as a youth, I had visited my cousins in Jamaica, and I shared with him, I shared with Bobby, what amounted to only a few existing memories, but cherished memories about my summer with my cousins, three beautiful, beautiful sisters, whose last name was Lewars. And when Bobby wrote back to me, oh, what a surprise. What a surprising gift he delivered, completely unsolicited by me, the gift of knowledge of my cousins, which literally brought me to tears. It is this same brilliant sensibility, this same enthusiasm for collecting little bits and pieces of people's lives. It is this sensibility of inquiry, of creating an archive of memory for thinking and writing about the meaning of all those bits and pieces. And this is what is manifestly evident in Bobby Hill. And I say this knowing that I am not alone in my admiration. The noted anthropologist David Scott at Columbia University wrote of his having worked with Robert Hill and the Garvey papers at UCLA many years earlier. And he says that he was in awe of Hill's tireless search for documents bit by bit, his familiarity with just fragments of evidence, and his ability to bring everything together and to consciously build an archive and publish multiple volumes. Scott describes coming away from that experience in this way, and he published this in, what is it, the X, small X. And I quote him. Well, let me just say first that Scott describes his experience with Robert Hill with a sensibility that Scott calls the archaeologies of Black memory. So I want to quote David Scott for you. He says, I gradually came to realize, and he's talking about working with Robert Hill, that embedded in the seemingly quotidian construction of this archive of the mass movement founded and led by Marcus Garvey, its events and institutions and rituals and personalities and correspondence. There was an activity and a thinking of its events and institutions and rituals and personalities and correspondence. All of this, there was an imagination that opened out vast populations, it opened up vast possibilities, not just of memory, but of counter memory. And then Scott goes on to describe Hill as having given him a sensibility toward modalities of memory, toward problems of tradition and practices of criticism. So I want to conclude by affirming and applauding my friend, Professor Robert Hill's impressive interdisciplinary embrace of history. Professor Gates and I are both interdisciplinarians And Bobby, your embrace of history and anthropology, as well as literature and the visual arts. How fitting it is today that we will hear from you on the remains of the name, the Harlem Renaissance at 100, and the missing Egyptian Renaissance that fueled and fashioned it. Let us together welcome our speaker, Robert Hill.
Evelyn, thank you for that beautiful introduction. Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, and thank you so much for coming out this evening. And I think there are a number of people in Jamaica, in California, even as far away as Mauritius, who are going to be looking at the live stream. So I want to send a shout out to everyone today, far and near. I came to America 54 years ago, and I can still remember that lonely bus ride from Kennedy Airport to the East Side Terminal, and my disembarking from that bus and getting in a taxi. And when I told the taxi where I was going, he kind of looked at me and hesitated, because I'd been invited to be the guest of John Henry Clark and Eugenia, and they lived at 137th Street in Harlem. And this taxi driver must have thought, I'm going to Harlem. Only later I learned that, yeah, you're going to Harlem. I could never have dreamt 54 years ago that I would one day be invited to come and speak on behalf of the W.E.B. Du Bois lecture series. I want to thank you, Professor Gates, for what, for me, is a very singular honor. And I feel humbled to have been asked to speak to you. I'm dedicating this lecture today to the memory of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, because he features so prominently in, as you will see, in what I have to say. The Harlem Renaissance is something that I resisted for a very long time, because I felt the awe, the sheer awesome responsibility and the awesome grandeur of what came out of the Harlem Renaissance and came with the Harlem Renaissance. And so for a very long time, I was hesitant to be drawn into it. I also knew that it would take a huge amount of work, and I'm not a literature person, and I didn't know if I had the skill set to undertake an examination of this very important topic. And I had this dread that the Harlem Renaissance had this magnificent yet delicate quality about it. So I was somewhat intimidated. In the discussion following the lecture, if you'd like to know how I finally became attracted to this subject, I'd be happy to share that with you. W.E.B. Du Bois was very, very closely associated with the Crisis magazine. It began in 1910, and by the fifth issue in 1911, in November of 1911, this was the cover of the Crisis, showing that Egyptian head. What I discovered along the way is that the Crisis magazine is a gold mine of Egyptology. Absolutely a fantastic gold mine. And so I feel it is fitting today that I can share with you the result of my research, because it too involves a great deal of Egypt. The cover of the magazine and the illustrations that go along with it are for an essay on African civilization by M.D. McLean. I've looked long and hard, and I cannot find any information about M.D. McLean, but I'm still looking. Now, this is one of the great discoveries for me personally. This is Maud Cooney Hare, who lived here in Cambridge. She fought a battle with Harvard University because they wanted to drive her out of the housing that she occupied. And she fought Harvard. She and some other Black women fought Harvard to a standstill. Maud Cooney Hare was a great musicologist, an outstanding pianist, and also a folklorist and author. In the pages of the Crisis, Maud Cooney Hare wrote this important essay on Ethiopian art. And in it, she says, quote, although not an Egyptologist, I have been interested for the past few years in following with anticipated pleasure the discoveries of Dr. Riesner in Egypt, and to note how truly the old legends and folk songs preserve the history and culture of a people. And then she goes on, Nubian scarabs, ebony figures with ivory inlays, and a decorated footboard from a funerary bed, Nubian, are among the many objects which Dr. Riesner states are not only interesting, quote, as specimens of royal work of the 25th dynasty, but also as throwing new light on the rise of the Egyptian Renaissance. On the rise of the Egyptian Renaissance. And it is the history of the Egyptian Renaissance here among Black people and white people here in America that I want to talk to you today. There could have been no Harlem Renaissance without this Egyptian Renaissance. The problem is that the Egyptian Renaissance has been written out of the history of the Harlem Renaissance. And that's a great tragedy. And it's also a great injustice to the people who helped to make the Harlem Renaissance. In November 1911 and November 1912, do you see the design of the Crisis? Those are Egyptian designs. See, Du Bois was still experimenting, trying to get the layout and the presentation of the crisis. And in 1911 and 1912, he was experimenting with the design of the Egyptian heads for the motif of the crisis. Jesse Redmond Fawcett, one of the key figures of the Harlem Renaissance and who was the literary editor of the Crisis magazine, wrote this long article on nationalism in Egypt. And this article appeared in April of 1920. Half of the article is on ancient Egypt, and half of the article is on modern Egypt. And this is how Jessie Redmond Fawcett ends her article. Quote, "Who doubts that Egypt is really speaking for the whole dark world? Thus is the scene being staged for the greatest and most lasting conflict of peoples." That is the same issue, April of 1920, in the crisis, that Du Bois has this response to the question of Negro writers. He says, quote, "One colored writer, Claude McKay, asserts that we rejected one of his poems and then quoted it from Pearson's, and intimates that colored editors in general defer to white editors' opinions. This is, of course, arrogant nonsense, but it does call your attention to the need of encouraging Negro writers. We have today all too few, for the reason that there is a small market for their ideas among whites, and their energies are being called to other and more lucrative ways of earning a living." Note what Du Bois is saying in April of 1920. There is scarcely a market for the ideas of Black writers. April of 1920. This would change within 2 to 3 years, and it became an avalanche as whites took an interest in writing by Black authors. The question is, how did that market, how did that demand for Black authors come about? What generated that market for Black literature? That's what we're going to examine today here. But Du Bois goes on. "Nevertheless, we have literary ability and the race needs it. A renaissance of American Negro literature is due. The material about us is in the strange, heart-rending race tangle, is rich beyond dream, and only we can tell the tale and sing the song from the heart." This is the first call for there to be a Black artistic, cultural, literary renaissance. It's April of 1920. This is a photograph of the very troublesome Black writer Claude McKay. Caused a lot of trouble wherever he went. See, he's a Jamaican. This is a Jamaican, and he's not going to take stuff, and he's also going to make a way for himself. In February of 1923, Du Bois inaugurated an editorial intervention. Each year, early in the year, he established what he called a debit and a credit. He looked back at the year preceding and he would line up the debits for the year that had ended, and he would line up the things that he felt were to the credit of the race. And in February of 1923, this is the start of this editorial innovation, debit and credit, 1922. My hand shakes very badly. Do you see what I was pointing at? Here, it's over here. And Du Bois says in a postscript, "We will gladly explain any of the above items which you do not understand." In many ways, this lecture today is responding as Du Bois would have. What is the meaning of Tutankhamun? Okay? If you're reading this in 1923 and you're not sure what Tutankhamun stands for, Du Bois is saying, I will help to explain it to you. And that's what this lecture is about today. That was by way of a warm-up. Okay? The remains of the name, the Harlem Renaissance at 100, and the missing Egyptian Renaissance that fueled and fashioned it, 1922 to 1925. This whole area is known as Savannah, Georgia. And this is near the waterfront of Savannah, Georgia. And that's the kind of thing that Savannah, Georgia is known for, this architecture. By the way, Savannah, Georgia was the first place that Kamala Harris visited after the convention ended. And I saw clips of her engaging with the community in Savannah, Georgia. It was really heartwarming that she went to Savannah, Georgia. Savannah, Georgia is the place with one of the oldest Black newspapers in America, one of possibly no more than 3. Black newspapers begin in 1865 in the South. And this newspaper started in 1875. In the issue of December the 7th, 1922, the Savannah Tribune published this report on the front page. Quote, "Egyptian tomb, amaze explorers. Art treasures 3,200 years old uncovered." Now, it's amazing. I still don't know. I have only a hazy guess that I can offer you. How did the Savannah Tribune get the report so early? The discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, news of it was officially published on the 29th of November. And yet by December the 7th, the Savannah Tribune, a Black newspaper, had one of the earliest reports of the discovery of the tomb. Most newspapers white newspapers didn't get the news until late December and early January. I believe that the Savannah Tribune was part of a kind of maritime network based in Savannah, where they were able to acquire knowledge of the world outside and beyond and receive newspapers. But here is what the Savannah Tribune says, down there in Savannah, Cairo, December the 5th, it says, quote, British expedition has unearthed below the tomb of Ramesses VI near Luxor, 2 rooms containing the funeral paraphernalia of King Tutankhamun, who reigned about 1350 BC, at a time when the now dominant and supercilious white races were in a state of barbarism. In those days, the torch of civilization lighted by the Negro race in Upper Egypt was still being carried by Negro nations. You hear what this man is saying? After forcing an opening with considerable difficulty, the excavators were amazed at the sight which greeted them. First, they saw the magnificent statues, all gilt, with exquisite carving, and the heads of Typhon, Hathor, and a lion. On these rested beds, beautifully carried, gilt and inlaid with ivory and semi-precious stones, and also innumerable boxes of exquisite workmanship. One of these boxes was inlaid with ebony and ivory with gilt inscriptions. Another contained emblems of the world of the dead. On a third, which contained royal robes, handsomely embroidered with precious stones and golden sandals, were beautifully painted hunting scenes. There was a stool of ebony of fine workmanship, altogether a collection of art treasures, unsurpassed and hardly equaled by anything in existence today in the Western world. These folks in Savannah, Georgia, understood what Tutankhamun meant. It meant that your stuff that makes you so supercilious ain't so grand after all. Now you have to deal with us. It concludes, there were also splendid paintings on the walls of the chamber showing the king in triumph combat with the foes. The king and his forces were all painted as dark brown. Many scenes depicted them in pursuit of foes, the latter being painted yellow and plainly denoting Asiatic. Several scenes showed Asiatic prisoners of war being guarded by the fair tribesmen of the Sudan, in whom Egypt usually placed her trust in the brave days of old. There is a further article on December 28th, which quotes from an interview with Breasted, Professor Breasted, the American Egyptologist. I won't read it, but here is a timeline for us to keep in mind. The tomb was actually discovered on November the 4th. The first stone step is uncovered. Do you know how the tomb was discovered? It was discovered by the 12-year-old water boy. The water boy whose job it was to bring the containers of water to the workmen doing the work. And they would say to him, don't spill it. Careful how you put it down. And he took his foot this day to move the sand in order to get a level surface to put the water container down on. But his foot felt a flat stone under his foot as he moved the sand. And it was the sense that if there is a flat stone there, there's something underneath it. And he ran to the archaeologists to report to them, I have found a flat stone. And they came and they started to move the dirt, and sure enough, that was the concealed entranceway to the tomb. So the credit should really, that's a scene, a picture of the Valley of the Kings in Luxor. The tomb was actually discovered somewhere. Sorry, this is that's the young man, Hussein El Abd Rasul, a member of the famous Abd al-Rasul family. They had been working with archaeologists since 1891, and they discovered, that family, had the experience of discovering important finds. And so this family was kind of renowned. If you want workmen to work with you in your archaeology, you go to this family. This family was renowned for it. And this is the 12-year-old son. And that's the entrance of the tomb as first seen. See, they had to move away all of the dirt, and it was covered over. The man who had the franchise for the area had gotten it from an American, a very wealthy American lawyer, who said that he felt that the Valley of the Kings was, the term he used was exhausted. He was no longer feeling that you had anything more to discover in that area. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a very wealthy British aristocrat, he was not so much himself wealthy, but he was married to a very wealthy woman, the daughter of the head of the Rothschild Bank. And she financed his interest in archaeology. But he too reached a point in 1922 where he said to the archaeologist, Howard Carter, I don't think I can keep financing this expedition, the search. And Howard Carter said to him, you know, if you don't do it, I will finance it myself. Howard Carter was so convinced that he should not give up. It was close. And Lord heir said, oh no, that wouldn't be proper. I tell you what I'll do. I'll let you continue for one more year, and then that's it. And Howard Carter said, fine. Howard Carter goes back out to Luxor. And if it hadn't been for that 12-year-old Rasul kid who used his foot to move the sand so that he could put down the water container on a flat surface, Carter may never have found the tomb. By the way, you know the history of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon because you've all watched Downton Abbey. His house is where the filming of Downton Abbey takes place. This is what some of the rooms in the buried tomb look like. Just a mass of what looks like junk. It took Howard Carter and a team of trained archaeologists 10 years to finally clear that tomb and preserve the contents of the tomb. There is Howard Carter scraping down the body. Can you imagine this man, Tutankhamun, had lain in that sarcophagus for 3,000 years? Earlier this year, I asked Skip, when he invited me to come to Harvard to speak at his Du Bois seminar, I asked him, I said, Skip, when are you going to retire? And he said, you know, when I'm dead. And then he said, my father used to say that when you're dead for a long time. Tutankhamun was laying up in this sarcophagus for 3,000 years. You know what it must be to go to sleep for 3,000 years? Yes. These are some of the scenes of what came out of the tomb. That's King Tut in the sarcophagus. Now, the interesting thing is that the actual coffin, if you will, where King Tut laid, was in the final of 4 coffins, all nested together in that. Okay, that's the container, and these 4 coffins are nested inside of that. I mean, the brilliant engineering feat of the Egyptians who knew about burying the dead is truly remarkable. And that's, of course, the famous golden funerary mask of the king. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the discovery of the Tutankhamun tomb in 1922, there was an outbreak of Tutmania. Howard Carter and his patron, Lord Carnarvon, became instant celebrities. Thousands of people converged on Luxor. 50 years later, when the treasures were brought to the British Museum for the commemorative exhibition, the daily queue was hundreds of yards long. I remember when that exhibition came to the United States in 1972. I had just moved to Evanston, and people were lining up in Chicago. It was amazing, the amount of keen interest that people were taking and buying tickets and queuing for hours to get in to see the Tutankhamun exhibit. And, you know, I resented it because I felt, what is it? What gives? What is it that is connecting them to this memory of Tutankhamun? I didn't get it. Like a lot of people, if white folks were interested in it, then that wasn't for me. I didn't see myself joining in it. I still don't quite understand what is it that what in the technical sense is called Egyptomania. Tutmania is a subset of the broader Egyptomania. What is it that caused people to go crazy about Egypt? One of these days, I'm going to go and look for myself, try to find out. But it happened. This is a site of some European tourists in Luxor coming to try to see what they can find in the tomb. Now, what is interesting is that the interest generated by this Tutmania affected white Americans very profoundly. This is the Saturday Evening Post of October 6, 1923, the front page. Palmolive, reincarnation of beauty. You even have King Tut lemons. The women in their fancy Egyptian dresses. The Egyptian style totally transformed the dress styles of women in the world. Old King Tut was a wise old nun. It was probably the most popular song performed and sung during this period, celebrating what they called Old King Tut. But Old King Tut was a boy. The movies took it up. This is a film feature called The Vengeance of Tutankhamen. They even had an Egyptian bathroom. You know, you see on television the advertisements here for, what is it called? You know, redesigning and your bathrooms. God, they play that commercial so much. Well, folks were working on their bathrooms to make it Egyptian. How could so much be generated by what came out of that tomb? The steps leading down to the tomb. There they are. Because what we now find is that the same thing happened among Black folk. A real King Tut chorus from the Pittsburgh Courier, June 9, 1923. A chorus in the Plantation Review, which recently opened on Broadway with an all-star cast. I can't make out whether these chorus women are actually Black or they're just high yellow. I don't know, it's possible. But here is a King Tut review. This happens to be one of my favorites. The popular blues singer of the day, Alberta Hunter. And the caption is "More Clothes." More clothes is the cry these days, and the photo above shows how it appealed to Miss Alberta Hunter, the blues singer and phonograph artist, who has assumed here what she calls the King Tut pose. Check this. King Tut is not something you read about as intellectuals do. You perform King Tut. And if you're going to perform King Tut, then Black folk are all over that. What I remember from 1972, when the exhibit traveled to Chicago, the King Tut Treasures exhibit, Black kids in New Orleans created a special King Tut dance. I remember that. In other words, King Tut, you wear King Tut, you perform King Tut, you consume King Tut. It's not just something to be read about. Oh, this is lovely. This is the cover of The Crisis from 1928. See the woman with her Egyptian bob? This is the cover of The Crisis. And to her right, right by her neck, is the Egyptian pyramid and the palm tree. And you say to yourself, look at those eyes and look at that face. What is, Du Bois is the editor of The Crisis. Du Bois is saying, look, this Egyptian thing that we identify as is really beautiful. This is from the Baltimore Afro-American picture of the Egyptian bob. They call it the very latest haircut. Egyptians bobbed it 2,000 years ago from the Chicago Defender. This is interesting. No King Tut bob for her on the left, but the one on the right has her King Tut bob. In other words, King Tut was a whole choreography. King Tut gave to people, black and white, white and black, a new design to follow. Except, and here I'm going to tread very carefully, where Black women are concerned, anything having to do with the hair has special significance. So although white women also wore the Egyptian bob, for Black women, I want to be careful. I can't speak authoritatively, but I think Black women were working something out for their own hair, which is something that men don't understand. Certainly, Black men need to appreciate the role of the hair for Black women. Bobbed hair girls, more numerous here. Few under 25 with long tresses now seen on busy city streets, while 90% of schoolgirls clip theirs off. So you even have an intergenerational thing with the styling of the hair. Oh God, this is for you, Skip. This is from the Pittsburgh Courier, where to purchase the Courier in Cleveland. The King Tut Barbershop. J.L. Jones, proprietor. On Quincy Avenue. It's what? Just like here. The King Tut Barbershop. Hello? Am I missing something? In other words, black men going to their barber shop had an opportunity to express their feelings about King Tut right up in the barber shop. Now, I subsequently found, and I can't find it right now, a subsequent article from this newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, that said that Brother J.L. Jones, the proprietor of the King Tut barbershop, had a new supply of roots that were now available. Brother Jones is also into roots. You come to the barber shop if you'd like some roots, and Lord knows what else. You were good. The very latest style, pleated dress of King Tut, satin and serge for $379. This is from Mullins, West Virginia. The younger set of Mullins attended the dance given by the King Tut Club of Tams. Tams is obviously a place in West Virginia, and they have a King Tut club. Mother-in-law looked like Madame. Mother-in-law of Tut looked like Madame Walker. See Negro King Tut. See Negro King Tut and his treasures and the black man's part in the Bible by Reverend Webb. Was King Tutankhamun a Negro? The Boston Globe reprints photograph of the reddish granite monument in the museum at Cairo. Howard Carter says King Tut was a perfect lover. That's important. The Tutankhamun Blues, thank you. Here it is again in the Chicago Defender. Now, I'm not going to try to sing this blues, but there are the words. Tut, tut, tootsie, goodbye. Tut, tut, tootsie, don't cry. The cuckoo birds that take thee away from us. A white man they will try to make thee. Kiss me, tootsie, and then do it over again. I'm truly fascinated by how black folk took over this figure from the tomb in Luxor and made a whole cultural world of it. And you see, that's the energy that's driving and that's going to generate what we subsequently will term the Harlem Renaissance. This is the source of the energy, not only among black people, but it's what's driving white folks to rethink their perception of black folk. Now, I'm going to attempt to say here, H.R. Hans Robert Jauss, the German literary theorist, came up with a concept called the horizon of expectation. And here is how it is described. The horizon of expectation is a structure by which a person comprehends, decodes, and appraises any text based on cultural codes and conventions particular to their time in history. May I sit for a minute? What the horizon of expectation means is that Black people have, when they ask the question, was King Tut Black? That's their horizon of expectation. They want to know, does King Tut fit our horizon of expectation? And is King Tut now going to expand upon our horizon of expectation? White people also have their own horizon of expectation. So when they look and they learn about the opportunities created by King Tut in terms of fashion, in terms of a King Tut bathroom, an Egyptian bathroom, they too have a horizon of expectation that's responding to the enormous new forces that the King Tut mania is going to generate. One of the things that Tutmania generates, a few people have any consciousness of it, is that the worldwide design known as Art Deco. Art Deco was generated by the Egyptomania created by the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. Oops. This is not. This is not. Did I turn it off? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. At this point, we recognize the immense popularity of the King Tut mania among white folks. And I dare say that's what drove so many of them to Harlem, because here in America, we had our own Hamites up in Harlem. In fact, you don't need to go to Luxor. You just take the A train to Harlem, and you got it right there, baby. In January, on January 25th, Arthur Schomburg, for whom the Schomburg Library in New York is named, Arthur Schomburg, who was a good friend of Alain Locke, he says, "My dear Locke, I would like you to prepare something during my incumbency of president of the American Negro Academy as a matter of association and friendship. But I fear you won't be with us this summer. The enclosed copy of a letter I'm mailing your president may take root. I would like to have you present at the opening of the king's tomb." King Tut's tomb. So the actual sarcophagus has not yet come up out of the tomb or been opened. I have every reason to believe he is a Negro. And the opportunity to verify and check the Lord's words of bituminous wood, which you know is coal, bituminous wood, is within our grasp. See, Arthur Schomburg's horizon of expectation, he's seeing the possibility of a confirmation that King Tutankhamun was a black man. And he's asking Alain Locke, a professor of philosophy at Howard, I want you to go out to Egypt this summer. But it also shows how crazy these black thinkers were, because you couldn't just go to Egypt and walk up and say, I want to see King Tut. I want to see the body. As we will see, the fear was that the white archaeologists, and they were all white, were going to do something to disguise the hair. In other words, the hair is the marker of Negroness. And they want Locke to go out there to verify, as someone who can verify with his own eyes, what does this famous figure that they have now discovered, what does he look like? But that is such a naive and crazy thought. They have no idea how you go about this. But they're going to persevere. They now go and meet with the last white president of Howard University, Dr. J. Stanley Durkee, the last white president. And Johnny Bruce follows up. See, there are 3 black men who are now going to sponsor Locke's trip to Egypt. Johnny Bruce, who is very old, he will die within a year, writes on 4th February, please find enclosed Dr. Durkee's reply to Schomburg letter which sent to you sub rosa. Our scheme is to get him committed in your favor, then to have our friends bombard him with letters urging your selection as the proper person to go to Egypt. We must keep this matter under the rose until something substantial develops. They don't want to spook the white archaeologists out in Egypt. They don't want to let them know we're sending a spy to watch what you're doing at the tomb. So we have to be very careful. Now, this is a classic. Schomburg writes, my dear President Durkee, on the 19th of February, 1923. Durkee, you know, was a minister, a white religious minister. I remember vividly the picture of Christ and the beautiful story you related to us when in your study 3 years ago. The more you looked at it, the more it reflected the eternal light of him who came to save the world. This has made me feel that if we could interest you in sending one of your professors to Luxor to observe and give his impressions of Pharaoh's historical tomb with the imprimatur or consent, the president of Howard and faculty, it no doubt will arouse the consciousness of thousands of our people who will be more anxious to send their children to Howard University in preference to other schools where their interest in welfare, when gratified, would not be looked upon with friendliness and solicitude. It would in many ways reflect not only on the institutions, but on its far-sighted and big-hearted president he's stroking down Durkee. trying to get Durkee to give Locke leave for 6 months so that Locke can go out to Egypt. Johnny Bruce follows up. Glad you received the Scientific American. I had noticed, and I intended to mark the passages in article to which you allude, but I knew your eyes were keen enough to see them and analyze their import. There has been considerable lying done by these discoverers and their accomplices, the press. I note now that there is a tendency to discredit the greatness of King Tut, since the prospect is that his tomb will not be opened. The Scientific American published 2 extensive articles on the opening of this tomb in Egypt. And this is what Bruce was alluding to. This is the second article, Tutankhamun's tomb. And what Johnny Bruce takes from these articles is that these discoverers are going to fake it. You don't have white scientists in charge of your king after 3,000 years. They're not going to tell us the truth. That's the deep fear. Now look at the cover of the Crisis in April of 1923. Do you see the Egyptian? The Egyptianizing influence that is registering right in this period, the spring of 1923, and it would never die out. And the title of the image is Egypt in Spring, a drawing by Laura Wheeler. And this is what we have been alluding to, this phenomenon known as Egyptomania. There are books about it. This is one of the greatest in the entire library of Egyptology. It's called The Egyptian Renaissance, the Afterlife of Ancient Egypt in Modern Italy. It's by a man called Brian Curran, who was in this neck of the woods for quite a long time. Did any of you here know Brian? Okay, a remarkably fine scholar. Here he is. Brian died from ALS in 1917. I just wanted to pay tribute to Brian. The Crisis then publishes this article, this report in August of 1923, under the auspices of the Negro Society for Historical Research and on sabbatical leave from Howard University. Professor Alain Locke leaves for a 6-month program of library research and archaeological observation in the field of Africana. Du Bois is using this word Africana. This is very early. But Du Bois also knows you can't spook these people who are digging the tomb of Tutankhamun. So he's very coy about the purpose of Locke going out to Egypt. He says it's for library research and archaeological observation. He will visit the chief European libraries and then leave for the more important excavation sites of Northern Africa, especially those of Egypt, of Upper and Lower Egypt. This is Alain Locke's passport photograph and passport that he traveled on to Egypt. This is the manifest of passengers on the ship going over to Europe. In the Negro World editorializes, Professor Locke at King Tut's tomb. When Howard Carter, the co-worker of Lord Carnarvon, in the discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun at Luxor in Egypt, which interested mankind everywhere and which caused the death of Lord Carnarvon. Carnarvon was bit by a mosquito and he was shaving and it scraped the bump or the skin swelling from the mosquito bite. And sepsis set in, and he died a terrible, painful death in late April. But when he dies, that gave rise to the whole myth of the curse of the mummy, long associated with the tomb. This is Locke's hotel, the Grand Cataract Hotel in Aswan, overlooking the Nile. Locke said, staying there, he couldn't, it was for an American dirt cheap, but also the luxury. Locke was living like a white European would. That's a map on the left of the area of Luxor. And while Locke is in Luxor and he goes to the tomb, he writes a long article called The Impressions of Luxor. How many of you have ever read this article, this essay, His Impressions of Luxor? It's really a remarkable article. But when Locke comes back to America, we notice that he doesn't publish it where he published all of his other articles and essays. With the sole exception of this essay on Luxor, Locke publishes everything that he writes in Opportunity magazine, the magazine of the National Urban League. Locke chooses to publish this important essay, Impressions of Luxor, in a journal called the Howard Alumnus. Now, personally, I don't have anything against the Howard Alumnus, but it's not a place where you would expect to find earth-shaking articles or articles about this an important archaeological discovery. Why does Locke publish it in the Howard Alumnus?
Because they gave him, that was the deal. The president said, you can go, but you got to publish it.
Okay, that's a way of saying don't let anybody know that you were out in Egypt, because you're hiding it when you do that. You're not really, okay. I had not heard that one before, so this is good. That's true. Except if you try to find locations today of copies of the Howard Alumnus, it only exists in one place. Nobody else has a subscription to it. You wonder why did he choose to publish in
That Marcus Garvey conspiratorial mind view.
Yes. Okay. All right. Now, these are two excerpts from the article. Quote, Tutankhamun's tomb may yet contain many more secrets than it has already revealed, but two of peculiar significance are already assured. One is the evidence of an extraordinary and apparent sudden flowering in the artistry of this period as gauged by comparison with the craftsmanship of the tombs of the immediate predecessors. And the other is evidence of the complete assemblage for the first time in an intact condition of the ancient royal cult of the dead. Which of the two will be of greater importance cannot yet be clearly determined. However, it is safe to assume from the character of the art objects discovered that another great classical period of human art has been revealed. Locke is sizing up the world historical importance of the treasures of the tomb. And then he says, these objects already displayed in part at the Cairo Museum are not merely fine in one aspect of art, they are indeed the most richly composite art in the world, and only a certain wizardry of craftsmanship keeps them from being in bad taste as too ornate, elaborate, and mixed. For they combine the arts of the jeweler, carver, lacquer, and inlaid work, embossing, engraving, and sculpture. It seems the most marvelously composite art in existence, but it is art nevertheless of a fine, almost classical expression because of the balance of its various elements and its technical perfection. And this is the closing, the ending of the essay. Locke writes, quote, "The great problem will be to account for this strange outflowering, this first great cultural renaissance." Thank you, Jesus. Locke has discovered the concept, Locke has discovered the formulation of a renaissance, looking at what is taking place in Luxor. That's why I was anxious to hear what Locke would say. In other words, Locke goes out to Egypt, he visits the tomb in Luxor, and what he discovers is this concept of a renaissance. Now, it's not just any renaissance. Locke says, what social conditions, what cultural influences produced it? Already the conjectures of the archaeologists are turning toward various known sources for clues. But wherever the impetus came from, it was, we must remember, focalized here in an African setting and in a polyglot civilization that must have included more African and possibly even Negro components than will ordinarily be admitted. So widespread is the impression that nothing profoundly cultural can come out of Africa, even though it may be found in Africa. Locke is on it. Do you see anything? This is Locke's very difficult handwriting. Do you see that word? The Renaissance. And then there's another one. The Renaissance of antiquity. And then below that, the ancient Renaissance. And I can't make that word out. Right there in the bottom left corner, Locke is working on the idea, what kind of Renaissance? This is a Renaissance, Locke knows, but he's trying to work it out. Now it's time to head back to America, this polyglot civilization called America. The problem was that it took me some years to find the passenger list with Locke's name on it. That's Locke's, no, there it is. He's coming back to America on the SS Tyrrhenia. This has been a remarkable venture for Locke to go to Egypt and actually be there, spend 2 weeks in Egypt. He comes down off the ship on January the 2nd, early morning, January the 2nd, and he hotfoots it. Where to? Here. This is the office of Opportunity Magazine and the National Urban League, 127, 23rd Street. This is the Lower East Side. This is the first thing Locke does. He goes to meet with Johnson, Charles Johnson. And he gives Charles Johnson an essay, which is composed either on the ship or out in Luxor, because it's published in the February 1924 issue of Opportunity, and it's called Apropos of Africa. The title bears a striking resemblance to an essay that Locke had read while he was in France, called Apropos of Negro Art by the great art critic and poet Guillaume Apollinaire. Apollinaire is the man who came up with the formulation and the word called surrealism. And he was also tremendously influential in the development of Cubist art. But this is a curious article. It's divided in 2 parts. The first half is providing Charles Johnson with what Johnson asked Locke to do, which is to investigate Du Bois's Pan-African Congress, which was taking place in Portugal, and to find out, to dig up dirt on Du Bois, basically. And the first half of the article is a report on Du Bois and the Pan-African Congress. The second half of the article is talking about what he, Locke, has been involved in. Locke says, later I shall write more specifically about the problems and opportunities of research in this field as they have come under observation in the reconnaissance, and Locke italicizes, underlines the word reconnaissance trip I have been able to undertake. For the moment, it will suffice to quote, by permission, the following representative opinion from a letter of Mr. Arthur Weigel, great Egyptologist, former Chief Inspector of Antiquities for Upper Egypt, a letter to that most eminent of archaeologists, the great racist Sir William Flinders Petrie. And this is what Weigel says to Petrie, Flinders Petrie. The study of the history and traditions of the African races by their own students is, I think, most interesting. And I'm sure you will find the idea of an African mind applying itself to ancient African manners and customs a very promising one. Locke had come up with a proposal that the Antiquities Service in Egypt would welcome students coming to Egypt from Howard, and they would train them in archaeology, Egyptian archaeology. And Locke felt that their interpretive framework, what today we would call their horizon of expectation, would produce a different kind of Egyptian archaeology. And he was encouraged by the French archaeologists who had a special archaeological team working in Egypt. Sadly, Locke lost his interest in taking students. Locke says in this article apropos of Africa, out of over a score of most eminent authorities interviewed on this subject, all save two have substantially concurred in this opinion. And the two investigators who strictly relegate ethnological matters to the findings of anthropometry and naturally enough consider physical anthropology too scientifically neutral for there to be any advantage or peculiar point to our participation. That's how the profession thinks of us. Now, this is Arthur Weigel on the right, and this is Flinders, famous Flinders Petrie on the left, two of the great names in 20th century Egyptian archaeology. See, Locke is networking, and Locke is talking with these people, and he's saying to them, what do you think about Black students from America who we could send here? He wants to build at Howard University an archaeological program. The problem is that Locke is not the man to build such a program. The man at Howard who could do that, Locke was at war with, unfortunately. This is Arthur Weigel. That's him. And you see they're bringing the bust of Tutankhamun up from the tomb. And this is Howard Carter. This is what Locke would have seen out there. Now, at this point, we see the divergence that is now going to take place. On the right is the cover of Opportunity magazine, and notice the design. It is a design emphasizing primitivism, primitive African art. On the left is W.E.B. Du Bois's Crisis magazine. See how different what Du Bois is depicting is a kind of imperial Egyptian cultural ambiance. Underneath is the strength of Africa. What the cover on the right is emphasizing is African tribal art. When Locke comes back in January, he is coming back to the nascent development of the younger literary movement among the names now associated with the Harlem Renaissance, chief amongst them the young Langston Hughes. That's February. Charles Johnson comes up with the idea, it might be a good idea if we could round up a bunch of white literary agents, white editors, white publishers, white whatever, and have a dinner where we could introduce our young writers. And this is the famous dinner that many people say date the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, the Civic Club dinner sponsored by Opportunity magazine. And they're holding it at the Civic Club in New York. It was on March 21st, 1924, that Charles Spurgeon Johnson held a meeting at the New York Civic Club The dinner brought together Black writers, Black pundits, and white writers and publishers. This event became a dress rehearsal for what would become the Harlem Renaissance. And on the right is Du Bois's, the receipt for his civic club dues. Now, remember what Du Bois said in April of 1920? There is no interest in Black authors. He can detect no interest. But by February 1924, what happens is that this dinner, there are more white people looking to patronize Black creativity than there were actually Black writers at the dinner. This is a famous photograph of the young Black writers of the Renaissance and the movers and shakers. There's Langston at the front, Charles Johnson, Eric E. Franklin Frazier, Rudolph Fisher, and Hubert Delaney. Alain Locke has come back. This is February of 1924. It's a birthday get-together they're holding. And this is something that we have to note. The patriarchy is very heavy in here. And Black women are going to be kept at the margin of what became known as the Harlem Renaissance, because these guys are running the show. This is a dinner party that Black folks held at the Civic Club. And you see how fine they all are? Ladies, this gentleman over here is clearly an American. So it's an integrated dinner, but that's what dinners at the Civic Club look like. This is what the Civic Club looks like today. A lot has changed. The dinner to mark the debut of the younger school of Negro writers was supposed to be a coming out party for Jessie Redmond Fawcett for the publication of her first novel, There Is Confusion. Tons of ink and miles of paper have been devoted to the controversy, because what Alain Locke did was that he took control of the dinner. He was the master of ceremonies. And what should have been a celebration of Jessie Redmond Fawcett, Alain Locke took control of and turned it into a platform for these distinguished white guests. Many, Jessie Redmond Fawcett never forgave Alain Locke for what he did that night. One of the things that happened, very important things that happened at the dinner, is that this man on the right, Paul Underwood Kellogg, who was the editor of the Survey Graphic, thank you, magazine, is he's now targeting potential Black writers, Black organizers who he can pull in to edit a special issue of Survey Graphic. This is the eventual publication. Now, there are a couple of stories about what took place at this dinner. and the meeting with Paul Kellogg. It is said that Paul Kellogg was so taken with the eloquence and the cultural ambiance of the evening that he said, my gosh, these are some remarkable young, talented writers and artists. Negroes, talented Negroes. And as he talked to them, they kind of made him think, what can I use them for? Now, if you believe that I have a bridge to sell you, because serious publishers, and Paul Kellogg is one of the most serious, they plan months in advance. They develop an agenda. So when Paul Kellogg came to that dinner, he came to the dinner with an agenda. He was simply trying to identify who he could rope in to do the work to publish a special race issue, as he called it, of Survey magazine. Charles Johnson, who was the organizer of the dinner, do you notice what Charles Johnson, he's listing out, I don't want to touch a button that's going to give me trouble. Among the guests present, and they're not in any alphabetical order, were Paul Kellogg, editor of the survey. See, Kellogg had already been in conversation with Johnson, and the plan was Alain, Locke, Johnson himself, and a young black writer who had been associated with the Negro world. The three of them would be the team that Kellogg would supervise to assemble the special issue. But Charles Johnson was out of town when the meeting that was scheduled for them all to meet was out of town, and he decided he couldn't come back. They didn't want to lose time, and Kellogg said, we'll go ahead. And Locke said, fine, I'll do it. That's how Locke became the editor of the special issue of the survey graphic. This is what the survey graphic looked like. I have to tell you, I've been around publishing for some time. When I examine the publications of the survey graphic and the team of people that Kellogg, it was an incredibly impressive team of editors and technical people who knew their craft. And so Alain Locke takes over the editing of the special issue. Charles Johnson drops out. And this is the result. Now, this is a landmark event in the evolution of the Harlem Renaissance. And this is a landmark cover, one of the most famous graphics to come out of the 1920s. But would you know, according to Locke's biographer, Locke was not in favor of using this powerful image of the black singer. Thank you, Roland Hayes. This was one of the types, as they call them, who were drawn by the German graphic artist Winold Reis. The original cover was this: survey graphic number, Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro. 1 week before the issue went to the press, somebody involved with the circulation and the marketing of the journal came up with the idea, let's put Roland Hayes's image on the cover, and they dropped the original design. And this is how Roland Hayes, the painting of Roland Hayes moves to the cover. But Locke said, I think it conflicts with the design. He said it's too busy. And you know how Kellogg got around his objection? He said, well, let's ask Roland Hayes. How would you feel if we used your picture on the front? And Roland said, fine, go ahead. But Alain Locke was not in favor of it. Now I'm speaking for myself. You may or you may not agree. I feel that there is between the head of Roland Hayes and the golden funerary mask of Tutankhamun a certain energy. Okay? For a long time, I wondered, what is it about Roland Hayes's head that reminds me of something? And I said, it's the famous funerary head of Tutankhamun. And if that has some merit to it, it means that we have our own Tutankhamun. We have our American, Black American version of the Tutankhamun king. Now, the first issue sold out within a month, and that was 25,000 copies. They had to go back for a second printing. And this is from David Levering Lewis's book, When Harlem Was in Vogue. And David Levering Lewis says, quotes from Paul Kellogg to William E. Harmon of the Harmon Foundation, November 20, 1925. Quote, we sold 42,000 of our Harlem number, which ran into 2 editions. Again, I ask you, August of 1920, thank you, August of 1920, Harlem is not on the map of editors. August of 1920, publishers are not interested. But by November 1925, the Survey magazine, the Survey graphic magazine, can't keep copies on the shelf. How do you explain it? And what led to that demand? I think it's a reflection of the Egyptomania that spread across America between 1923 and 1925. I've been signaled that I need to wrap up. What I want to say is that when Alain Locke came back to America, he decided to switch to primitive African art. And in doing so, he became locked into an embrace with the French collectors, the French theorists of primitive African art, and this is one of their famous publications. Okay, now just think about what you're going to see here. Locke becomes an exponent, a theorist, you might say, of primitivism. And you can't apparently do that and keep the classical Egyptian going at the same time. Locke chose primitive African art as the foundation for how he was going to mold the Harlem Renaissance. And this man, Albert Barnes, the wealthy Albert Barnes, would become his main patron while he's doing this. This antiseptic agirol, he had patented. You know what agirol is used for? When infants are born of mothers who have gonorrhea, the gonorrhea will get into their eyes when they're born. And this is the antiseptic. It's a nitrate. And Albert Barnes was an industrial chemist. And he had a German chemist work on formulating this. And Albert Barnes patented it and became a multi-millionaire. It's still used in hospitals when children are born. But Albert Barnes was also a pugilist. And so what you have is this dominating figure, this millionaire figure who believes that he is the last word on African art, and a young man called Alain Locke. And they team up, but that's not going to last. They're going to split. This is from Barnes's Marion Foundation home. This is the new Barnes home in Philadelphia. I hope at some point to go and visit it. And there's a new book that will be published in April by a man called Blake Gopnik, called the Mavericks Museum, Albert Barnes and his American Dream. This is the new Barnes Museum. Barnes had been going to Paris and fell in with these two people, Gertrude Stein and her brother, Leo Stein. They're very rich white Americans, but they also developed strong friendships with the Cubist painters. This is the famous painting of her by Picasso. And this inside of her home in Paris was an art gallery. And when Barnes visited Gertrude and Leo Stein, he got blown away. And he decided to use his millions. Gertrude Stein said he flashed his wallet around. Do you know what it is estimated the Barnes collection is worth today? Do you have any idea? $6 billion and counting. Yeah, okay. This is the textbook that Barnes wrote, The Art in Painting. Okay, now I'm going to move very fast because I want to get to when Alain Locke goes to meet Johnson. He comes off the ship, the Tyrrhenian, the SS Tyrrhenia, and on the note paper that he took with him from the ship, he has a list of things that he's to do or he's involved with. 5 copies of Curlin's book, Wright Culin at the Brooklyn Museum, suggest the Dunbar art exhibit, Rush article on Barnes Foundation. Then Crisis plus Johnson Anthology. André de Maison, Jean Theroux Paul Gilliam, which was the art dealer in Paris, where he met Barnes. It was in Paul Gilliam's studio and gallery that he met Barnes. Apollinaire, Dr. Barnes and Apollinaire. In other words, coming back from Egypt, he falls in with a set of people who are going to totally turn his head now from Egypt to primitivism. And this is the special issue that Johnson and Locke produced of opportunity on African art. And that's a picture of Charles Johnson. Charles Johnson writes an editorial to preface the whole issue on Dr. Barnes. And here is Johnson's conclusion, quote, "Soon primitive Negro art will invade this country as it has invaded Europe. It is inevitable. And there will come with it a new valuation of the contribution of Negroes, past and yet possible, to American life and culture. It is on this certainty, that Dr. Barnes has quietly combed Europe for the choicest of the specimens brought from Africa, and is even now urging serious study and exclusive research into the field, still uncharted by competent and interested students." What a delusion. Alain, Barnes is going to engineer this revolution in America because primitive African art is now arrived. That's crazy. And yet they believed it. They bought into it. They went all in on this delusion that soon primitive Negro art will invade this country. In other words, they want to promote what had already been established in America from 1914 when Alfred Stieglitz opened his gallery 291 at the bottom of Fifth Avenue in New York. That's his 291 gallery, exhibiting the earliest exhibit of primitive African art, quote unquote, in America. There is Stieglitz with his fetishes. And that's his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, with this peculiar phallic-looking spoon from the Ivory Coast. Another picture of their gallery with their hanging of primitive African art. The man who helped to engineer the first exhibition in Stieglitz's gallery is the Mexican caricaturist. His name was Marius de Zayas. And he collection, notice that's a Picasso painting on the ground. How, when, and why modern art came to New York. In other words, this is a current exhibit, recent exhibit called African Art, New York, and the Avant-Garde. What Alain Locke and Charles Johnson are hoping to achieve has already taken place. And there is going to be no vogue of African art. African art was already here. Why these two men believed what Barnes was telling them and fell for it, I can't say, but this is Alain Locke's article. This is Barnes's article on Guillaume. This is Guillaume's article, African Art at the Barnes Foundation. Now, This is the table of contents of the survey graphic issue. There you see Albert Barnes's essay, Negro Art in America. Okay, all right. Thank you. Well, thank you, Skip. Thank you for the opportunity. Okay, thank you. Okay, have a nice dinner. Okay. Uh-huh. And this is the table of contents of Alain Locke's expanded version of the survey magazine issue, the survey graphic. So over here, you see Albert Barnes, who comes way down. Notice where he comes in the New Negro. He's the second author in the New Negro. In other words, he is the strength of his influence with Locke and Johnson means that he keeps rising in their valuation. This is Albert Barnes's article. 2 years later, they issue another special issue of Opportunity devoted to the Barnes Foundation. His in-house theorist and aesthetic philosopher, a man from Princeton called Thomas Munro, produces this article on primitive Negro sculpture. In other words, primitivism has won the day, and it has displaced the Egyptian art. It has displaced the interest in Tutankhamun and Egypt as far as Locke is concerned. But Locke is determined to try to get established in Harlem something he called the Museum of Primitive African Art. And he got money from the woman, wealthy woman, who was the publisher of Theater Arts Monthly. Her name is Evelyn Isaacs. She gave him $1 million to go to Europe and to buy a collection, which would then form the basis of Locke's proposed Museum of Primitive African Art. And they're going to tour this collection here in America, and Locke has curated it. But notice something. When it gets to Chicago, the Women's Club of Chicago, who are sponsoring the exhibit, come up with a flyer advertising the exhibition in Chicago. And you see the Egyptian figure dominating the flyer. And over here on the right, down at the bottom, is a representation of an African fetish from the collection. Now, what I'm going to adduce from this is that the artist unconscious cannot be overwritten. Locke may have in his mind this European fetishization of the primitive African art that has come to dominate his mind and displace his interest in Egypt But the artist knows different. The artist cannot be manipulated like that. So if you say to the artist, could you design a flyer for the exhibit that we're planning? He comes up with this. The Egyptology, the Egyptianizing influence in him is going to assert itself. Now, Du Bois had a critique of Alain Locke. When Du Bois was reviewing Locke's The New Negro, published in December of 1925, he says, if Locke's thesis is insisted on too much, namely that art could not be mixed with what they call propaganda, he said, it is going to turn the Negro Renaissance into decadence. And that's exactly what happened. By the exclusion of the Egyptian, the writing out of the Renaissance of the Egyptian influence turned the Harlem Renaissance into a form, an activity of decadence. Yeah. Okay. All right. One last minute. Okay. Earlier this year, I'm in my study in Jamaica, and I'm looking at the New York Times. This guy was at Harvard. This is what I want to say. On February 18th of this year, the New York Times published an article called 6 Artists Reflect on the Legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. Oh, I said, ooh, that's so interesting. You see, the Museum of Modern Art in New York had just opened a new exhibit called the Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism. See, they're still riding the modernism thing. The problem is that when you go down that road, you get locked in and you can't exit, because modernism means primitivism. I'm looking at this thing and I say, wait a minute. Something is going on here. Am I seeing right? I had to clear my eyes, you know, and I said, let me keep looking. There's a young artist here called Derek Fojor. He's a graduate of Harvard. He did an MA in education here in Harvard. And he painted this picture. Do you see what I'm seeing? In the artist unconscious, Egypt is asserting itself, independent of the theorizing of the professional academics who write and study the Harlem Renaissance. This is the brother. 6 artists. And the article says, Fojor often quotes directly from Harlem Renaissance artists like Archibald Motley Jr. and Richmond Barthy. He says, in order to keep their contributions in art historical consciousness. Thank you, Derek Fojor. Because I've been trying to persuade people, don't forget Egypt. You've got to keep a focus on Egypt. Otherwise, you won't understand the dynamics of how the Harlem Renaissance came about, nor the emphases of its artists. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out.
We can continue this conversation at the reception, which is right across the hall.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm thirsty. I'm really thirsty. Thank you. Thank you. Let me get my stuff together.